Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. We're going through Gospel of John, chapter 13. I think we are on verses 21 to 30. The format is I will have some general comments in the beginning. Then Gary, who's doing a master's thesis on this chapter 13, is going to have a presentation. And then we will have a succession of people who will be making comments like Evanique, Ron, Joe, Becky, Brian, Penny. And then I'm going to invite everybody else to make comments on the gospel, on these particular verses. What I have chosen to do today is something unusual. What really struck me this time was just this one or two lines, which are about John resting on the chest of Jesus. And it brought so many observations to me. And I want to talk about John as an apostle. I want to talk about John as the writer of this Gospel of John, role of John in the Gospel himself. So I just want to talk about John, both from his character and the Gospel of John itself. And then we will go into the main part. And I invite, after we've done the verses, I will invite Gary to comment on the unique nature of John as apostle, the unique nature of Gospel of John, and then everybody else after we've gone through all the commentary, okay? So I'm going to say this in three parts. First, I'm going to talk about John the Apostle as is presented in Gospel of John. Second, I'm going to highlight the comments made about Gospel of John by my friend Nick, with whom we did just John 1. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about Gospel of John as John is author of Gospel of John. So those are the 3 points I want to make. So firstly, here you see that he is reclining on Jesus's breast. Okay, he's the beloved apostle, and he loves Jesus. Now, when you trace him throughout the Gospel of John, it is said that the first two people was two disciples of John the Baptist who start following Jesus. As soon as John the Baptist points him out, one of them is John. He's the one here. He's the one who goes with Jesus after he's being arrested. He doesn't leave Jesus as many of the apostles do. He goes with him. He's there at the bottom of the cross. He's the one that Jesus says that this is your mother, and this is your son. He has a very special place in this story. Jesus loves him, and he loves Jesus. He's the one who lives the long life and dies of natural causes. He's the one who has the passion for the mission, and he's the one who is able to express it better than anybody else, I think. So that's him. Now, when I had my conversation with Nick, I asked him, why do you like Gospel of John so much? Because Nick liked Gospel of John enough that he actually chose to master Attic Greek so he could read this gospel in original. And he does, in the video I'll put it up at some point, or Joe, if you can find it, Nick's presentation. The first, he did 2 parts on just John 1. So I asked him, Nick, why Gospel of John? And his answer, he's a very thoughtful person. So he says, first thing is that like every sentence in this gospel has what he said has overflowing fullness. Like each sentence, it is quite stunning of what this work is. And he says, as you read it multiple times, and he has really read it, he has immersed himself in it. And he says, it gives you grace upon grace as you read it. There is no end to it. You think you've gotten something and you read it again and you get more. He says, John has a privileged relationship with Jesus. He also is giving a testimony. Now, it is true that all the Gospels are testimony. They are giving testimony. And testimony are just like in a court testimony. These are multiple testimonies that actually go together. Each person will have their perspectives, but it's the perspective on the same story. He has a mission. Let me just quickly shift now to the third part, which is the character of this work. I mean, John is described as the eagle, and it is true. He starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I mean, what a beginning. What a beginning. I mean, the only thing I can compare it to in music would be Beethoven's Fifth. Ba 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 bum. Sets up the whole symphony with just those notes. And everything else is just elaboration of it. It is contained in that. Look at the power of it. It is the statue of David standing in the piazza in Florence. And what it would feel like, yes, exactly, Ron. And what it would feel like the first time somebody saw it. This feeling of wonder, feeling of just a second. I think we've got some problem, Zoom bombers. So you can just, I'm going to remove all of them. Can you go ahead and remove all of them, folks? Thank you. So that's what it is. It has that characteristic. Secondly, he's the eagle. He goes at the highest height and then swoops down in the simplest of concretes. He brings the deepest of principles. And he does that all the time. So he's operating at 30,000 feet, and he's operating on the ground all the time. The other thing I want to say is that we've been studying literature. We've been studying Dante. We've been studying Goethe. We've been studying Dostoevsky. We've been studying Shakespeare. We're looking at poetries. The writing here actually compares favorably with the greatest of writings. I mean, the beauty of it, the sheer beauty and power of it just blows me away. So there is just so much, Leonardo used to use the term excellences upon excellences, of just packing everything good in this one thing that you're making. And that's what this work is. So after we have done discussing these particular verses today, if we have time, I'm going to request Gary and anybody else to comment on both John the Apostle and the nature of Gospel of John, right? So with that, let's go to Gary. Gary, go ahead.
Hello. So I do have a couple of slides for a PowerPoint. I haven't rehearsed them, so please forgive me if I have difficulty with it. But if I'm set up, I can go ahead and share the screen. Is that all right?
Please do.
How's that?
That's good.
And so this is actually a portion that I was kind of like waiting for. What is most significant for me in the section of that we're reading is how it ends. Jesus gives the sop to Judas. Judas takes it. He departs, and it was night. And that's our conclusion to what's taking place. That's also the whole pericope of the narrative. It ends there, and this narrative of the foot washing becomes the prelude to the farewell discourse. And so it's for me, what I've been especially what I've been doing in my studies is talking about the farewell discourse as exposition of the love command, and how it's set up by this foot washing, this whole episode. And so everything that follows is in reference to that. Lots of words, but I'll kind of summarize it. And this is really in full agreement with what Shrikant was just saying, is that chapter 1, the prologue, is just so important. It sets up the whole gospel, and everything else is expounds on it. And so when we get to 13, the first 3 verses really capture the whole prologue. They sum up the whole thing. And so it evokes all that. Chapter 13 itself, I talked about it last time about the transfiguration and stuff, is that it itself, chapter 13, is a recapitulation of the entire gospel, with the foot washing as the pinnacle of Jesus' ministry. This is everything that Jesus did is captured in the foot washing, and that's kind of the vision of it. The evoking of the prologue, Jesus' identity of logos, is then brought to the fore. And the logos is not something that was, you don't see it as such in the Hebrew Bible. There's a number of wisdom traditions, but it definitely distinctly points to the Greco-Roman audience. And so there's a modern commentators are very strong of the opinion that what John is doing is he's casting a wide net. And sometimes we in the past have had a very myopic view, is John talking to Greeks, or is he talking to Jews, or is he talking to the Gnostic people? Who's his audience? And the conclusion is really it's a wide audience, and that he incorporates a number of different traditions, intentionally so, to kind of just bring everybody into this story. That's the second section in the same 3 verses. Not only is he evoking the prologue, but he's also reminding them of John the Baptist, who said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." It says, here we are at Passover. And so it's the time for that. And then, like I already said, is beginning in 1331, we have the actual, the extended discourse, the farewell discourse proper will begin. The key thing in this slide that I want to point out is that almost all of the biblical texts need to be read with what they call a binocular vision. From Judges all the way through the historical books, these were all written after Israel was already in exile. And so they're talking about a history that took place sometimes, hundreds of years before. And so it's not just about the event that happened and when it happened, but it's from a perspective of the future, looking back on it. Or, the same thing is especially true of the Gospel of John. And I kind of brought that up is he's there taking synoptic material and taking Pauline material and then redescribing it in a different way. The big example is the temple. The temple no longer existed when John writes his gospel, but when you pay attention to the narrative, he's constantly returning to Jerusalem or coming from Jerusalem. And the whole reason why we know that Jesus has a 3-year ministry is because there are 3 Passover festivals. And so Jesus in John's gospel spends more time in Jerusalem and in the temple than any of the other gospels. And so it's a focus of what's taking place, and it's an intentional focus, but it's also holding the whole socio-political environment in tension. It's looking back at what it was and what it is now, and grasping into that. And once again, he writes for an audience that's familiar with the Greco-Roman perspective, but his perspective is also coming from Israel's rich narrative theological perspective. And so we're going to see these Greco-Roman themes reimagined from a Jewish context. This actually speaks to what you were talking about, Shrikant, is that a number of people, sometimes we look at Peter, we look at John as individual disciples, but kind of like in the parable of the sower, lots of times the disciples are there sitting in as archetypes of the Christian experience. This guy, Andrew Byers, talks about the likeness that we have to God in John's ethics. And I have 2 of them pointed out, is in the beloved disciple, just as you mentioned, Jesus sits in the heart or in the bosom of the Father in chapter 1. And then the beloved disciple is described in John chapter 13 as sitting in the bosom of Jesus. And then as we proceed through the farewell discourse, Jesus is going to say, I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. And so we're imagining or envisioning that exact same relationship, that it's not just a peculiar thing to John. It's, in that sense, it's idyllic. It's something that we're all striving to be. Partly from the perspective of John, it's something that we have when we realize it. Through faith, when our eyes are open, we can see that we are sitting there nestled in Jesus' bosom. But we don't really realize it or enjoy it if we without those eyes of faith. Something that many people will miss is in John chapter 9, there's a blind man. And they ask him, who are you? Did you do this? Are you the one that was healed? And he ends with the same I am statement that we see repeated throughout the gospel coming from Jesus. He says, ego eimi. And so we have this, again, when we talk about theosis, the idea is our likeness to God. And so we see envisioned throughout the gospel all these different ways in which the human characters take on attributes that are described of Jesus. And so we see this right here as in the blind man, when he is healed and he makes the choice to become Jesus' disciple, he actually appropriates the ego eimi appellation that Jesus had been speaking. And then we also have Philip associated, from the beginning, this idea of seeing. Philip is there in John 12, bringing the message of the Greeks, saying they want to see Jesus. And then Philip, once again, during the farewell discourse, says, show us the Father. And all of this points back to Exodus 33, where the character of God is revealed in response to Moses, who says, show me your glory. And so again, there's this aspirational thing where, the disciple, as they become like God, want to know God and want to see him more so. I brought this up a little bit, is the Greek epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And it was only when I was looking at the notes for the Zoom last night that I still haven't attended, but I went and started reading the book that you referenced to. And the very first thing he brings up is Homer's Odyssey. And then the Odyssey, Odysseus returns home. And so for me, it just clicked. You have this homecoming. That's exactly what John 13, 1 through 3 is saying is that Jesus knows that he's going back to the Father. It's the same homecoming. And the scenario in Homer in the Odyssey is Odysseus is getting his feet washed. And so you have this really interesting thing taking place where we have a foot washing scene and this associated with the homecoming in both the Odyssey and in the farewell discourse in the Gospel of John. But when I talk about narrative theology, what they'll do is they'll evoke an image from the past, whether it's a Jewish or a Greek tradition, and then it'll be re-envisioned in a different way. And so that's kind of what's taking place right here. What's very similar, and this is where there's a similarity to the Bhagavad Gita also, is the main thing in Homer's Odyssey and what's happening here is the revelation of Jesus and his divine character. And it's kind of ironic where Homer's identity is made known through this scar, the symbol of his mortality. And he feels threatened by it. He doesn't want his identity to be known. But in the farewell discourse, this is the very way in which the nature of God is made known, is through his humility, through his foreseen passion. In my thesis, I brought up the Gita to in my introduction as the way story forms communicate so much more than just a retelling of the story. A surface reading, and I don't want to sound too ignorant myself, but the very surface reading would say, oh, the Gita is just about, does Arjuna go to war or not? Can we just skip to the end and see what the answer is? You miss the whole point. It's the journey there, which requires the revelation of Krishna in his full manifestation that makes, and Shrikant can correct me if I'm wrong, this is what makes the decision so significant. And the same thing is taking place in Jesus in the farewell discourse. The only command in the Gospel of John is the command to love that we'll be introduced to in 1334. And lots of scholars see this as just a very simplistic command, and that the gospel has like little or no ethical value. And if you're only looking at that tiny little thing, it's like skipping to the end of the Gita thinking that you know what you're talking about. It only makes sense in light of the revelation, in light of all the other theology, in light of everything else that's taking place. This is just, I have this slide up here just to give you guys a heads up if you were interested. This gentleman named Kellam wrote an article in a book called Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospel, where they talk about the different kinds of farewell discourses, that as we go further on and Jesus gives the farewell discourse, there's lots of different, we have examples of it all over literature and Greco-Roman literature, definitely throughout Jewish literature and in the apocryphal literature too. So we have lots of things that we can compare it for. Another gentleman, Segovia, took all of these and talked about the different criteria that go into what constitutes a farewell discourse. And so this is maybe a little more academic, but if you're curious as to what's going on, one of the things that's taking place is that there are all these features that are sometimes common, sometimes not. It's a pick and choose. And so those features that are present, in Jesus' speech tell us a little bit more about what's going on. We compare with what's present and what's absent. And so academically, all this information like really helps us like get to the heart of the message, especially when you look like, is it prophetic? There is definitely parallel to Socrates' last words. There is the idea of a battle, whether or not Jesus is calling his disciples together to prepare for a spiritual war. Things like this may contribute to our understanding of the discourse. This is something that stood out to me in one of the commentaries, and I don't see it mentioned very often, is that the conclusion of the narrative ends with the words, "It was night." And it's a reminder that everything that follows after is happening under cover of darkness. And so frequently we'll focus on it was night, its symbolic value. that it was night in Judas' soul, that it's symbolic of his malice, and then we forget about it. But it's setting a mood for everything that follows. And so there's kind of that suspense, and almost a horror element there. This dark room, the world is going on, but it's also pointing back to John 1:5. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness cannot receive it. And so we're returning back to the whole setup. This is where it's all coming from. There's two perspectives. There's the perspective of Judas, and then the perspective of Jesus. And commentators, and even us in our discussion, will be looking at it from those two different perspectives. The one that I like to highlight on that's really significant for me is how Jesus is fully in control. And I can't remember if my next slide has this or not. Is whatever Judas might be doing, whatever Satan might be doing, nothing gets done until Jesus gives him the sop and says, go do it. And so it's the locus of power, the locus of control, even though in the context of this betrayal and everything, the locus of power is in the hand of Jesus, that not even Satan or Judas can do anything until he gives them permission. And so this is this idea, especially in Jewish literature, of God's immense power over all things, good and bad. And so we're being reminded of God's sovereignty over the whole situation. Cyril of Alexandria, I was looking in my commentary, he's one who talks about the ambiguity of what's taking place. Is we're looking at it, is it Judas that's doing the betrayal, or is Satan doing it through Judas? And what's the real battle that's going on? And so he's focusing on the idea that there's a spiritual war taking place, and that the Judas as an instrument is a reminder of the world in which we live in, when bad things seem to happen, whatever they are, that it's not those things themselves, that we're really at war, kind of like what Paul says in Ephesians, against principalities and powers and spiritual forces. That's where the real struggle is. And so he says that when Jesus says what you do quickly, he's speaking to Satan and not to Judas. And he also considers this actually as a command. It's a summon into battle. He's saying, all right, let the fight begin, which I kind of like that. There was a debate. Aquinas, I think, argues strongly against the idea that communion is being offered to Judas. But within the early church fathers, that was quite the debate. And Chrysostom, pointing to 1 Corinthians 11, argues that it is a communion, that Judas did the very thing that Paul tells us not to, which is to don't come to the love feast and don't take communion with an impure motive. Another thing that's kind of sticks out for me is that Jesus is troubled 3 times in the gospel, always in the context of foreshadowing his own death. It's before Lazarus, before the resurrection of Lazarus. Again, in chapter 12, he says, my soul is troubled, and what should I do now? Shall I ask for it, Father, to take this away from me? And that speech there in chapter 12 reflects what we see in the Gospel of Luke when he's praying in the garden, and he says, Lord, take this cup away from me. It echoes that same sentiment, but concludes, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And then finally, the final element is right here, is in John chapter 13, he is troubled again. Having foreknowledge does not suppress his distress. And so that's kind of an important thing for us to even remember. The conclusion there, and Satan entered him, we get that right before it was night. This is, there's a lot of debate as to, when did Satan enter him? And I think Aquinas talks about this. In the context of John, we're about to have a discussion of abiding. And so we see this Satan entering Judas in contrast of the fact that we abide in the Son, and the Son abides in us, and the Son abides in the Father. And so this notion of abiding and being in the household of God is contrasted with Satan who enters Judas. And something I bring up is I noticed it earlier on in Aquinas's commentary when he was doing verses 1-3 and throughout. You'll see many commentaries focus on harmonizing the gospel accounts. And so as a literary work, what we're looking at, or at least from my perspective, is I'm looking at the differences. I'm gonna let the other commentaries harmonize the gospel. That's fine. For me, it's very interesting when it's different, because I'm assuming that John is familiar with the literature, he's familiar with the synoptics, and that he could have just harmonized it himself and made it the exact same thing, but he chose not to. And so when I see these little differences, that looks like the timing of the Passover is different, or he doesn't mention the baptism, but he does mention the Spirit. When John says to Peter, "Thou art Cephas," it evokes Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah, that we see in Matthew 16. All these little differences, what's omitted and what's included and how it's changed, those are all very interesting to me. And that's what I like to focus on, is thinking of what is John's literary intent. There's a reason why, he could have totally made it the same, but he chose not to. And those are the things that stand out to me. And that's all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gary. Really appreciate that. All your observations, just great. All right. Next, we're going to have Evanique, Ron, Becky, Joe, Brian, and Penny. And after that, anybody else who wants to comment on these verses are welcome to do that. I think we should do one reading of the verses. Let's see. Penny, are you ready to do a reading? Let's see who's ready.
I'm ready.
Go ahead, Penny.
Okay. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to the disciple and said, "Ask him which one he meant." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give the piece of bread which I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. "What you are about to do, do quickly," Jesus told him. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the feast or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night.
Thank you. Thank you, Penny. All right.
Shrikant, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Penny. Folks, feel free to talk about anything about these verses or anything general that stays with you. Let's not respond to each other at this point. Let's just put our thoughts on the table. Once we are done with that, then anybody who is not named here is welcome to share their thoughts, after which everybody will comment on everything everybody has said. All right. So next up is Evanique, followed by Ron. Evanique.
Yeah, so the first thing that I'm going to talk about is John the Apostle. And the first thing that came up with me with the Aquinas commentary is the way John was reclining on Jesus. And, it starts with saying the lap, and then John moves up to the breast, right? And Aquinas points out that, that's such an intimate relationship because he's close to his mouth, and that way he can hear everything that Jesus is saying. And if we're going to talk about archetypes, like Gary was saying, I think John would be the archetype of devotion. As he was devoted to Jesus, like he wanted to be close to him. He didn't care how it looked. I mean, if you think about it, in Jewish time, in the day, John reclining on Jesus and like being on his lap and on, his breast, that's so intimate. It's like John didn't care what anybody else thought because he was so devoted to Jesus. And I think of Arjun and Krishna and the devotion. And it just strikes me that like that was what John was dedicated to, the life of Jesus. And even after Jesus died, Aquinas points out that John remained a virgin. It was like John didn't have any other, he had the intimate relationship with Jesus. Like he was truly in love with Jesus. And, I just thought like that was the first thing that pointed out to me about John being the apostle. And the second part is that John describes everything in a third person. And Aquinas points out that's a humbling thing. Like, so he doesn't say, well, I was on his lap, I was on his chest. He says, he talks about himself in the third person. It's like he almost distances himself and wants to tell it and tell his story in an objective way. I think the next thing I want to point out is the part where he talks about Jesus is troubled. And Aquinas made a good distinction, I think, in saying that Jesus allowed himself to be troubled, that Jesus troubled himself. And he gives examples of in John 9, where the blind man, I think it was the blind man in the troubled water, like, they were talking about, the troubling of the water, and, different passages in both the Old and the New Testament where the water is like deliberately troubled. And he was saying he was doing that so that Jesus could show us the example of what to be like when you're troubled, when your soul is troubled. Jesus was that example, and he allowed himself to be that example. When he allowed his soul to be troubled so that he could show us how to be in that situation. So I thought that was interesting. And then the next thing he talks about is the heart of Judas. And, he talks about, at what point did the devil enter Judas, and why did God allow the devil to enter Judas? And he goes into this part where he talks about Judas's heart. And he said, Judas is like, that the devil enters the heart, right? But at first he has to enter the mind. And in order for that to happen, it has to be allowed. So at some point, Judas, being who Judas was, allowed the devil in. Like he didn't, even though it says in the scripture that that the devil entered Judas's heart, at some point Judas led a life that allowed that to happen. And I was thinking of the center and periphery argument. When you let the periphery guide you away, I think that's what happened with Judas. I think he allowed the periphery to take over the center. And, Aquinas was pointing out that Judas was always, this, I don't want to say evil, but I guess for a lack of a better word, but he was always, I guess he was just always in it for himself. He wasn't really in it to get to know Jesus. He was really in it to get to know himself. And I know we talked about it in previous meetups where at one point Judas may have thought he was doing good for the Jewish people. And I don't disagree with that. But I think if he had been focused on the center or focused on Jesus, he would have realized that Jesus was coming to save the Jewish people, not to destroy them, or in a sense, maybe destroy the structure or the system, but not the Jewish people. In he was coming to free the Jewish people, but Judas couldn't see that past his periphery. So I just thought that was interesting. And then it was something else I was going to say. Jesus, I'll remember it later, I'm sure. But I just thought those points were interesting. Oh, the last part, now I remember, was, all the other disciples, you can tell that their hearts were, I don't want to say perfect, but I will say their intentions were good and pure, in that they just thought, Judas was just going out to get the food, or, they didn't have any, they didn't have any negative feelings towards Judas, because they thought Judas was just going out to give to the poor, or they just thought Judas was going out and getting the preparations because he was the treasurer. They didn't think anything bad of him until he betrayed Jesus. And it shows the character of Jesus, because Jesus could have said, you guys, I just told you he's going to betray me, and you guys are just sitting there. But Jesus is like letting them discover it for themselves. And I always think it's like when something just seems obvious, like I'm always like, it's obvious that this person, has ill intent. I always say, for me, it's like I always like I get a bad vibe from certain people, but Jesus knew, and it is such a good example, because Jesus knew what Judas was going to do, and his disciples still didn't get it. And he doesn't say, "Don't you get it? This guy's about to betray me." He doesn't trash Judas. He just lets them discover it for themselves, because eventually people will discover for themselves who other people are. And so I just thought like that was just interesting. I thought Gary's presentation was amazing, but we're going to talk about that later. So I'm going to end it here.
Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is going to be Ron, followed by Becky. Ron.
So in this section, one of the things that really helped me a lot is to go back and try to keep this in context as to what just happened. And Jesus is saying in verse 8, I don't speak concerning all of you. I know whom I've chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you before it comes, so that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am. And so then immediately you see in verse 21 where we start, is when Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit. So if we didn't go back a little bit, we have to wonder, why was he all of a sudden troubled in spirit? And he was troubled because, as Gary said, he's foreshadowing his death. He knows it's coming. He knows the hour is at hand. And he knows what Judas is going to do. And he's telling the disciples beforehand, and he says, the reason I'm telling you this is going to happen before it happens is just like with the rest of the miracles, especially in John, is to verify and authenticate his claim to be God in the flesh, that I am. Most of the English translations are going to add that I am he on it, but it's not found in the Koine text. So when Jesus says these things, he becomes troubled in spirit. And he says, most assuredly, or verily, verily, or amen, amen, I say to you, one of you will betray me. And as Gary was saying, one of the things that's really opens my eyes is when I see something in one gospel that's not in the others. Why is it not in the others? In the synoptics, they say, is it me? And here they don't. They don't say that. The disciples looked at one another and they're perplexed about whom they spoke. But in John, no one asked, is it me? Now to get at John himself, in verse 23, now there's one leaning on Jesus' bosom, one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. And this is how John refers to himself throughout the gospel. He's the disciple whom Jesus loved. He never says I. It's always third person, but not just third person. He doesn't say John did this. He says the disciple whom Jesus loved. And I was always perplexed at that. But as you watch John's behavior throughout not only the gospel that he wrote, but in the three synoptics as well, you can tell by his behavior that he loved Jesus tremendously. But he refers to himself not as the disciple that loved Jesus so much that he was at the cross. This is the guy that loved Jesus so much that he went into the trial when everyone else ran. Instead, he focuses on Jesus' love for him, which I think is absolutely profound. And one of the key things that we can take away from the Gospel of John is, whereas Peter is always saying, Lord, you know I love you. I will go to death for you. I'm going to cut this guy's ears off for you. John is just the opposite. He doesn't stress how much he loves Jesus, though he certainly shows it with his actions. But he's just amazed and in awe of the love that Jesus had for him. And I want to stress, it's not that Jesus loved John any more than the other disciples. Not at all. Not at all. But John seems to have been much more aware of just how much Jesus loved him and everyone else. Contextually, looking at how John is leaning on the bosom of Jesus, that was the place of honor in that society. He's sitting at the right hand of Jesus, dining with him. In the culture of the time and to this day in Middle East culture, to eat and break bread with someone is a big deal. You just don't eat with anyone. And so when John is here leaning in this treasured position, it reminds us back in John earlier on, when in the parable, not Lazarus who was raised from the dead, but the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And it describes where Lazarus went. He went to this place of honor, to the bosom of Abraham, right there, right next to him, in this close and intimate fellowship. And again, it's that abiding in and with. The next thing that I saw was when Jesus says it's going to be the person that I dip my bread in the sauce and give to. This was a sign of unbelievable favor. And we can miss this. The very sign that Jesus is using to point out who is going to betray him, it's like he's offering him, be my disciple. I'm giving you this honor. I'm not dipping my bread and giving it to John, even though he knows I love him so much. Come, take the bread of life. And as Gary said, he's doing it in an absolutely a manner that is the height of betrayal. Not only later does he betray him with a kiss, but here he's betraying him in the receiving of bread, which was such an intimate honor. It harkens back to David having Mephibosheth come and eat at the table of the king. One who is crippled, who is the son of an enemy, who was betrayed. And he's still, come eat at the table of the king. And Jesus is doing this, come Judas, eat at the table of the king. And he does it in betrayal. Just like later on in a little bit, he'll betray Jesus with a kiss. It's really tragic. I mean, it is the height of tragic. And then again, having received the piece of bread, he then went out immediately, and it was night. It was night in Judas' soul. It was night all around. One of the things that I noticed in looking at several different translations, some of the translations take out a lot of the immediatelys and now. And if you look at the Koine Greek text underlying whatever translation you're using, some of them are leaving out these very, very important temporal words that link one section to the other. And it links what Jesus is troubled at. When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit at this time. And then now there was leading on his bosom. And now after the piece of bread. And some of those are missing. If you look at them closely, grammatically, it's tying the future of what Jesus is going to do and what is happening immediately and what has happened. So it's tying everything from Genesis 1:1 all the way up to the end into what's about to happen. It's this place where the future and the past and the present meet at now. The future meets with the past now. And that's what's happening here. All of these things. He just got done saying that the scripture might be fulfilled. And now he's telling us about what's about to happen, and immediately, and now, and now, and now. And we can miss that. All of this is tying together in the cross at that central point where the past, the present, the future, and indeed all of eternity is found in one place. It's profound piece of text. It really is.
Thank you, Ron. Ron, that was beautiful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Becky, followed by Joe. Becky.
I think the part that really got to me was how Judas, having experienced everything in with such intimacy with Jesus, and still not responding. And it's you can see from the prior chapter where his heart was, like everything of making excuses behind what his true motives were. And it's hard to say that it's just Satan that or to attribute that Satan was the one behind it all, as Evanique had pointed out, that it takes more. And just like how it requires someone to respond to God through acceptance, it would be similar to respond and allow that kind of possession to take place. And I want to read a part in John 3 where it talks about that light and darkness. And this is very much in line with how Judas had responded to Jesus, especially after that intimate partaking of bread with him. And so John 3, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his work has been carried out in God. And I thought it was extremely appropriate for that section to end with, and it was night, because it was very much here is the light, and I've rejected him, and he is going to head to his death. And we see that there is no more light, but only temporarily. Yeah, I'll stop it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Vicky. Next up is Joe, followed by Brian. Joe.
So I'm going to start where a lot of people had started as well, is this idea, the troubled spirit, I think is very much worth exploring, because, we see a number of emotions that Christ has throughout the Gospels. We even see anger at a certain point, frustration with the apostles. But what we start to see is sadness. And what it means to be troubled is to really, and what this, and this sadness is profound because of something, that just Becky just said. Despite all the miracles, despite everything that he's done, he's being rejected. And we kind of all know what that feels like sometimes, when we feel like we've done everything we possibly could do and things just don't go the way we want. Now, this is the Son of Man that is done everything for us, but is being rejected. And to me, that speaks to, and I did find it interesting in the Aquinas commentary, how he did compare the idea of the Stoic sage to Christ, that the Stoic sage would never be disturbed, but that Christ was actually disturbed, and he basically was he was human. He was partly God, but he was human. And I think it highlighted the humanity, his transformation to man. Another interesting part of I really found interesting with the Aquinas commentary was this idea of we should not think the group is bad just because the individual is bad. Here's Christ, who has invited these individuals into his life. And one of them, and he specifies one, it's instead of a few of them, but one of them is bad. But if you think about it, this is the most select group in the world, in history. These are the ones that are going to be closest to God. And one of them is bad, and they make mistakes. And I often think about how we collectively punish people if one person does something bad, in many cases. Whether it be a family member does something bad, then we'll damn the whole family. If a member of a group does something bad, we'll damn the whole group. And just how unjust that really is. And I think that that's a very important thing to consider. And I had not thought about it from that perspective until I read the Aquinas commentary. I mean, that is really important. Here's God, the people he selected has been infiltrated. And I think that was profound for me. And collective punishment is something that we do still today. I mean, there are legal theories based on that. So I think that's something that's worth discussing, maybe even a little bit more. Sorry, a little scattered here. It's been said already, the way the devil has entered into the heart of Judas, it is with God's permission. I think Evanique had expressed it beautifully when she was saying that, essentially the devil can make us imagine that something is good, that we're doing something, the right thing, and that it's actually the wrong thing. And, it perverts our thoughts, and it's a troubled person. And it kind of makes me in a way think that it was an act of the will of Judas, but it's I don't know, I kind of go back and forth on this, because I start to think, okay, well, but the devil, without the devil, then it necessarily doesn't happen. So it's a very complex problem, is what I'm trying to essentially say. I always found John's actions to be the most pure, even growing up reading the Gospels. You mentioned one of the most important scenes where he says, "Mother, behold your son." To me, that is, it's an affirmation from Christ about John. The purity in his actions, the purity in his heart, are consistent throughout the Gospels, and I think that that's critical to understanding, and this scene in particular, or these verses in particular. Those are my initial comments. I have some more, but I'll hold off for now. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. That was wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Brian and then Penny. Folks, I'm just inviting these people because I know that they have immersed themselves. I'm sure there are other people who would like to comment, and you're welcome to do that. Go ahead and type ! if you would like to comment on these verses. Next up is going to be Brian or Penny. You can choose which one goes first.
I have a couple, I guess, 3 comments. The first one ties in very much with what Joe said earlier in the Thomas Aquinas's comment about Jesus being sad, and I thought that Thomas Aquinas's comments, and Joe's amplification on that explained very well. It just reminded me of the wisdom that's also in the Gita, where there's some governing principle or governing element, the passions, the sentiments, sensations don't just take control. After I'd read this and the Aquinas commentaries, I went back to prepare my own comments, and I had a couple comments just on the very first sentence, and they're tied into what Aquinas was also commenting on. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit. We talked about that, and declared, "Very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." So the 2 words or phrases I was focusing on after saying this was the first one, and the second one is just the word betray. I thought that was a very kind of just trying to understand what that word might mean in this context. So first of all, on the after saying this, that's the first thing. I know that other translations don't say exactly that, but there's a reference back to the washing of the feet and the things Jesus said in connection with that. And one of the things he says is, unless I wash your feet, you have no share in me. and so it is, it anticipates the next commandment, which Gary's already anticipated. It comes up in starting in verse 31. I think it's verse 34. Chapter 13, verse 34. Isn't that right? Yeah. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Just as I have loved you, you should love one another. Sorry, I didn't read that quite right. That's anticipated with the washing of the feet, and Thomas Aquinas spends a lot of time calling attention to that, and the importance of the action and illustrating through action. To me, the question is, this was a message to whom? To whom is this message being given? And I think that's, I just considered that important. Because as we talked about, and this is a reference, kind of a reference back to what we talked about the last time. There are those, again, with Judas and the other disciples, there are those who took part, and then Peter didn't want to take part. So the question arose, to whom is this addressed, and what happens to those who do not want to have their feet washed? And so it just harkens back to that discussion we had last time, and I wanted to raise that question again. This point of betrayal, I thought, was very interesting, and it has to do with Jesus' mission, or how he understood it and how the disciples understood it. If Jesus knew this was his time and Judas' actions were a necessary or intended part of that mission, then I guess it's, in some way, it's not betrayal, it's fulfillment. But in other ways, it is betrayal. It's a betrayal of the person of Jesus, clearly. I'm just wondering the other ways in which it might be perceived as betrayal. And when the word is heard by the apostles, it might be a betrayal. Well, the thought I have is it's a betrayal of a plan that Jesus had. That might be in the minds of the apostles or the people who heard those words. So that Judas might be trying to undo, or either through an act or through omission, trying to undo something that Jesus had planned. And that's, I guess I would say that's probably not the case, because Jesus had planned his at least had anticipated his crucifixion on this weekend, and he's sad about it, and all the rest. So I don't think it's a betrayal in that way. I think it's a betrayal of him, of the person of Jesus, and not necessarily plans he had. And that kind of led me to think, well, Jesus has completed all of his plan at this point, all of the actions he wanted to take. In effect, if you will, his ministry is done. And Jesus considers his ministry to be done. And the last things, so then that led me to look back on this whole week leading up to this Last Supper. And he'd done several things, but a lot of them are actually tied into old Jewish custom, pointing to the fact that he would be the sacrificial lamb. At Passover, the ritual requirement, the Jewish ritual requirement at that time was to sacrifice a male lamb at Passover, and families would display their male lambs at the temple so that everyone could check out each other's lambs and see how pure they were, that they were giving their best lambs. And Jesus did that too. Jesus was showing himself in the temple during the 4 days between the day he arrived in Jerusalem, which is Palm Sunday, and this Lapsusser. Those are the 4 days. And he was showing himself in the temple each day. We're not quite sure what he was doing on Wednesday, but the other days he was showing himself in the temple. And twice during that time, he cleansed the temple, throwing out the people who were selling animals for sacrifice, selling them for money. And so purifying in that way, purifying the ritual, the Jewish ritual, and purifying the temple. So I think this purification of the temple is a part of Jesus' plan. And with that, I guess he can, I don't know, but it would seem to me that he has completed his ministry, except for the crucifixion, his testimony before Pilate, basically the things leading up to his death, between the Last Supper and crucifixion. His public, if you will, you can't even say his public ministry, but he had completed much of his ministry in these acts during that week. And we'll get into the rest of the as we continue to read John. The other thing then that struck me as I was thinking that through, trying to see it from the apostles' perspective, well, Jesus said that Judas is going to betray me. And I don't know, but I'm guessing they would think, well, he's going to betray some kind of plan. Well, I don't know. We'll see now as we read the rest of John and we puzzle this out. I always have to kind of review things again and again in a new light. But I'm not sure that Jesus had announced any plans to the apostle after the Last Supper. He had not announced any plans that they understood. He certainly didn't say we were going to go, take over the government or something like that. There was no big, you do this and you do that kind of plan. There was just some intimations of what would happen that didn't necessarily involve the apostles, but that they'd be incidentally implicated, like denying Jesus 3 times for Peter. So I guess that word betrayal, I'm just trying to puzzle out how that might be understood by the apostles and what that indicates in the context. I think if there's no big plans announced, then and Jesus did anticipate his crucifixion on that weekend. I don't think that he planned any actions against the temple or the Roman state during those times.
Thank you.
Things were all done.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Penny.
Okay. Well, one of the things that interested kind of me in the Aquinas commentary, when they were talking about, Satan entered into him, and it was talking about Judas and saying that, Satan could not enter into the soul because the soul is part of God and God is pure. And so when Satan entered into him, he was not entering into the soul of Judas, like his mind or, but not the soul. And I thought that was interesting. Then I was kind of trying to think in my mind a little like the Bhagavad Gita that we had read recently when we were talking about the Atman, which is like, the piece of the, Brahman, the all-powerful Lord that each person has in them, but then how, they say that it can be clouded and, people do all these evil things, but their Atman hasn't become evil. They have become evil. It was just kind of intriguing when I had thought of it. I think before I always just kind of thought like the soul became evil is how, when they were saying, the Satan entered into him. I think in my mind, that's kind of what happened. And so I was just intrigued when they were saying, no, that isn't actually what happened. And then I was thinking on the other side then that, how people can be saved at any time. And basically the saying in the Gita too, if you come to realize what the center is, you accept Jesus, you accept God. And then I guess that's because, that part of you, the soul, is still pure within you. So when you make contact with that, then you're saved.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Penny. Does anybody else want to comment on these verses? If you would like to do that, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and try to highlight things that struck me from everything that has been said so far. And then I'm going to open it up for any comments anybody has on any of the points made so far. So I'm going to give about 5 seconds if anybody else wants to put their comments on the table. All right, let me get started. Firstly, again, I'm just so grateful with just this tremendous symphony of observations about such a rich work. With Gary, I'm simply just going to focus on connecting what Gary said about the foot washing in the Odyssey and foot washing here as an example of the difference between the Homeric style, the Homeric intention, and the intention here. Foot washing in Odyssey is being done by a woman slave to Odysseus. Odysseus is in the high position, she's in the low position, and that's considered permanent difference between these two beings. The entire scene, as is described, the way in which it is described, this is, again, I'm strongly recommending the work of Eric Orbach, who has done this. He actually shows you what is going on with the Old Testament and the New Testament, compares it to the classical Greek style, sees the echoes of both these styles across literature. That gives you a much deeper appreciation of what is being said by each of these works. The scene, the foot washing scene in Odyssey is uniformly illuminated. You actually see everything that is going on. It is like the painting that Phil pointed out of David, where everything is seen in foreground. Everything is uniformly illuminated. Not so in the foot washing scene or any scene in the Bible. Scenes in Bible are spotlighted. Individual actions have moral implications, psychological implications. They have been selectively chosen. There is a lot going on in the scene. but only certain things are focused on, because those actions carry the moral meaning, the psychological meaning, the philosophical meaning, the theological meaning. And they stand out to us. It's a very simple scene, foot washing. But look at the foot washing. This is a traditional way of two human beings interacting in Odyssey. That has been going on for many generations. Difference between human beings is taken for granted. Their position and the way you interact with them, their worth is all determined by, it's already fixed. They don't change much. Odysseus, though he's been away for 2 decades, he's exactly the same as he was. His nurse, who's washing his feet, is exactly the same as she was. Now fast forward to this scene in Gospel of John. Jesus is transformed from being the master into a servant and back to being a master. In the act of foot washing, suddenly the apostles are placed in the position of the master and are being urged by Jesus to be the servant, and through that being the master who serves. He's showing the equality of human beings in that simple action and urging them to spread that message of equality across the world in that just one action. Look at how much is being carried by that one action. Gary also compared this to Krishna Arjun, and so many people did. You know, Arjun is Krishna's favorite. Krishna loves Arjun. Arjun loves Krishna. And that is the foundation of Gita. You can't understand. It's a conversation between people who love each other deeply. Please note that in the war, Krishna has taken a vow not to fight. All he has is words. So Arjun is the apostle, and Krishna is communicating the message to him of what needs to be done to make the world right. And Arjun is going to carry it out. So these apostles are Arjuns to whom Krishna is speaking, Jesus is speaking. So there is that love between them. Now, next, I'm going to jump to Ron's point at this point. I think it's a very profound point that John says he's not the disciple who loves Jesus. He's the disciple that Jesus loved. Now, automatically we'll think that, oh, Jesus loved him more. But actually, that's not true. He's the disciple who has noticed, was paid attention, focused on, appreciated that Jesus loves him. The grace is raining on you, on everyone. The grace is raining on Judas. When Gary pointed out, he's giving him the bread. He doesn't give bread to John, he gives it to Judas. The grace is raining on Judas as much as it is raining on John. What separates John is that John says yes to it. He never forgets it. He always appreciates it. And he identifies himself with it. Who am I? I am the one who Jesus loves. I really liked Ron's point about the past, the future, coming alive in the present. All of the actions of Jesus are like that. Evanique pointed out the point that John is devoted. He's devoted to Jesus. Now, many people made this point about being troubled. Joe made this point, and I find it really beautiful. You know, whenever Jesus is saying he's troubled, and in so many ways, in so many places, you can see that. You can see the height of this when he says, "My Father, if it can be done, take away what is before me, this cup before me. Even so, not what I want, but what you want." So there is this trouble because he loves Judas. He knows what he's going to do, and he accepts that. He accepts that. And this is kind of acceptance of destruction, saying that there is that as part of the world. You are not turning away from it. We'll come to this in multiple ways. I really liked Becky's point about the light. It was night. And it's simply turning away, Jesus is at the center. He is the light. The light is giving the bread to Judas. And what does he do? He turns his back on the light. And that's where the darkness is, when you turn your back on the light. Joe talked about the point of do not damn people just because people can be bad. And the way in which Jesus deals with Judas here, it's a profound lesson. Firstly, it is saying that all of us have Judas in us, and there are Judases all around. But you do not damn people, human beings as such, because of that. You do not damn yourself. You do not damn the other person. In spite of that. Brian had this discussion about, the sacrificial lamb. I think that is beautiful. Brings in the entire context of the Passover. And he was wondering about, is this a betrayal of Jesus or is this betrayal of lamb? And it's very simple. As far as I understand it, Jesus is the way. He is the plan. So the entire way, and it's not the plan of what he's going to do now. It's the whole plan for existence of what human beings need to do. And it's the same. He is the way. He is the plan. So betrayal of Jesus is betrayal of plan. And the plan is not a particular thing that he's going to do, how he's going to deal with this person or that. It is much larger than that. It is the principle that, love one another. It is his entire message. That is the plan. And that is his person. So there is no distinction between betrayal of Jesus and betrayal of plan. Penny made the point about Satan. And I think the way in which Becky put it, I think it's Satan is simply turning away from the light. It is seeing God, seeing Jesus, and saying no, and turning your back. The light doesn't go away. That is at the core of your being. It's still there. It's just that you have turned away from it. And that is why there is that light that remains in you. And you can always go back to it. All you have to do is to turn towards the light. And that option you have at every point of time. So those are my thoughts. Now I'm going to invite people to comment on anything that they want to comment on anything anybody said. We're going to start with Ron, followed by Becky. Ron.
Shrikant, you beat me to what I was going to say with regard to what Brian was wondering. Is it Jesus the person, or was it the plan that he had? And if we just went back a little bit further, we would have seen Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the light. And so when he says, I am the way, he is the plan. His very person is the plan. He is the truth. So Judas is betraying the plan of God. He's betraying truth itself. And he's betraying the light. And then it ties in with what Becky said so wonderfully in tying in John 3. His deeds were evil. His heart was evil. So he turned his back on the light and went out from among Jesus and the disciples and goes out into the darkness. And then I wanted to bring, I think it was Penny, was talking about Aquinas's understanding of the soul. And I think a lot of Aquinas's understanding of the soul is he was very, very, very influenced by Aristotle and his idea of the soul, as opposed to his protege Augustine, who was influenced by Socrates. So I think Aquinas is overly influenced, I think, at this point about the soul, that it could not be corrupted, taken in light of the whole of Scripture, which says the soul that sins will die. And verse after verse after verse that says, no, in fact, our souls can be corrupted. And in fact, by nature are corrupted. So that was just my thought on some things about Aquinas, as brilliant as he is. I think sometimes he might be a little bit too influenced by Aristotelian thought and scholasticism. Yeah, that's all I forgot.
Thank you, Ron. Folks, please take your time to comment on anything that you want for as long as you want. Next up is Becky, Evanique, Joe, and Gary. Becky.
I want to comment on what Gary had mentioned earlier about power and authority. And so Satan the importance of Satan possessing Judas is because that conflict with Jesus is more than just with Judas. And that focus is often seen through Judas as the concrete, but it's a spiritual war going on, as Gary had pointed out, with Satan. And so Satan has the authority of everything on earth, and he also has the power of death. And for Jesus to come face to face with this, well, what do you gain when you defeat all that? Well, you gain that back. You gain that back, get back the power and the authority. And back when Jesus was being tempted in the desert for 40 days, Satan knew that this was what he wanted, because we see from the way that he's telling people how to pray in through the Lord's Prayer. It's our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He knows that that is the ends, like what is what he wants. And so, like, there's a shortcut when Jesus is tempted by Satan. And so it goes back to the spiritual fight. And he says through one of the temptations, the devil took him to a high place and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in an instant. And the devil said to him, I will give you all the power and glory of these kingdoms. All of it has been given to me, and I give it to anyone I please. So if you worship me, all this will be yours. And Jesus answers, Scripture says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So if Jesus had taken that shortcut, he would have reclaimed earth, but he wouldn't have reclaimed the power of death. And so he had to go to the cross and face Satan through submission, in order to reclaim that power of death. And one of the things that he does with, like, showing people or his disciples, you must do what I do. I'm going to wash your feet, and you're not greater than me. You must do as I am doing. And so he demonstrates that by going to the cross and taking up that cross. His disciples must do the same, because he, just as simply as Jesus could have reclaimed the world, it has to be done through the right way, through going to the cross, in order to not just reclaim what's going on here, but the souls of people. And so the part where he tells his disciples, like, do as I do, it says, if anyone would come after me, and let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? So it must go through death. It must go through the cross, and that I guess that victory is that at the end in Revelation, which is also written by John, he talks about that victory. He says he's saying it from Jesus's perspective. Fear not, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Becky. It's great. Next up is Evanique, Joe, and Gary. Evanique.
Yeah. So now I have so many things to say from what different speakers have said. So I'll start with what Becky said when she talks about, I think the overarching theme is power and authority, right? And we think of power as force. You know, that's the worldly way to look at it. Like it, but you're just looking at the now. And, you know, forcing someone to do your will. That's the way we look at power, or being able to convince or manipulate or persuade somebody to do what you want them to do. And Jesus shows us a different way of doing that through submission. And when Becky was talking about the devil tempting Jesus in the desert, and then Jesus telling him no, basically that, through that and through the death on the cross, by submitting to death on the cross, Jesus has power over it all. And Becky pointed it out in Revelations, where Jesus has the keys to Hades, and the keys to death. And I just thought about that, and I'm like, the act of submission is talked about throughout the New Testament. And I think it's so important because it almost brings a Stoicism theme, in that you have to accept it. You have to accept that death is a part of life. But there's death in so many forms, not just the traditional way of death and transitioning into the spiritual world. There's a death in, saying goodbye to foolish things of your youth. There's a death in saying no to things that no longer fit. Louis Sullivan, form follows function, giving death to the forms that you're so used to. It could feel like an actual death. Those forms are no longer serving the function that they were supposed to. You have to let them go. That could be a death. So I think it's the whole physical death, but it's also letting things die that no longer serve you. And I think submitting to it, and submitting to the transition and different transitions of life, is key. So I just thought of that. The point you made, Shrikant, it was great about Judas being in all of us. And
can I say something about this point about death that you and Becky made? Thank you. The most profound thing that I've learned about this is thinking of your own skull or human skulls as the grave of Jesus. Because there is death and there is rebirth in it. So you have to let things die in your skull. You have to give up those things. And that leads to resurrection. If you say no to that, if you're not ready to have your skull as the grave of Jesus, then you will not have the life. There is just going to be kind of downhill. You have to let it die, let things die, in order for new life to so that image I find to be the incredibly powerful way. Myron wants to comment. Myron has not commented yet, so I'm going to have Myron go next, and then Evanique, you can continue. Myron, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the flow of
But this is the flow, so go ahead.
Okay. I really just want to add on to what Becky, Evanique were saying about, and you were saying about dying and the grave. I want to actually read a little bit from chapter 6 of Romans. This time it's Paul who's trying to lay things out. And I'll be honest, something about the language of Romans really makes my brain gears go into overdrive, but I'm gonna give it a try. So I'm reading from chapter 6, and it says, "We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. For the death he died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God. So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Myron. Evanique, please go on.
Sure. Something that Myron said about Jesus had to die to sin. And I was thinking of that. And, I always thought, like, why the crucifixion? Like, why did it have to be so painful and so inhumane? And I think what Myron brought up is true. When you die to sin, it's painful. When you're dying to who you used to be, it's painful. And I want to say it's necessary. And because you are giving up that part of yourself. So it has to be painful. It's not easy. And you're going to have to do it all the time. And I was thinking of the scripture where it talks about carrying your cross daily, because daily you have to give up things that no longer serve you, or things that bring you away from who you are, or take you away from Christ. You have to give that up. So you have to carry that cross daily. And it just brought that to mind. I think the last thing I wanted to say is, actually, I was talking about the Judas and all of us. So two things, sorry. Judas and all of us that you were saying, Shurikat. And I think Joe was talking about it too, is that, we can't damn other people without damning ourselves. First of all, we're not supposed to be the judges. Like, it's supposed to be Christ. It's supposed to be God. God will judge. And Jesus even says that he's not the judge, that God will be the judge. And I think it's about, I don't even think it's about like a counter. Like, a lot of people think, God has this book, like this book of life, and he's counting every single sin that you do. But that's not the case. He's looking at your life, and did you give up what you needed to give up in order to be able to appreciate heaven? I think even, or appreciate the next transition. And it's just funny to me that, like, people think, oh, like Catholics have these things, you did this sin, a mortal sin, a venial sin, certain degrees to sin, and it's not even in the Bible. There is no degree to sin. And I think it's because it's about you giving up what you need to give up in order to move closer to Christ, and it doesn't have a number. So I thought that was great. And of course, the part about not damning other people is that the Gita, seeing the God in me sees the God in you, but it's also about, me having grace. And I think that leads me to my last point, where Ron was talking about John being in awe of how much Jesus loved him. And I never got that until Ron just said it just now, because I always thought that John was just a slight bit arrogant when he said, the disciple who Jesus loved. And I'm like, is he implying that Jesus didn't love the other disciples? No, but it feels that way. But when Ron brought it, I was like, wow, that's just a totally different way of looking at it. And when you look at it, that means he was in awe of his grace. And if we accept the grace for ourselves, then we extend it to other people. And you don't hold anything you don't hold any ill will in your heart for another person. You kind of just love them and respect them, even if they're, you wouldn't let them back in your life just for boundary's sake. I'm not saying you just let people who deliberately hurt you back in your life. No, but you do just have this thing where you wish them well, and you wish the best for them, and that they come to find Christ for themselves, or God, or whatever you believe in, that they come closer to their spiritual path. So I just thought about that, and I'm like, yeah, if you're in awe like John is, in awe of what Christ gives you, then you forgive. It's easy. I don't want to say it's easy, because it's not, but you understand why you have to like work towards forgiving others and extending that same grace that you were extended. So I just thought that was great. And then one last thing, the dipping of the bread. Now, I did not know this, Ron. Thank you for sharing and educating us that it was unbelievable favor. So Jesus, being the example for all of us, shows unbelievable favor to Judas and is inviting Judas to say, please come be my disciple. Please come be my friend. Please join the 11 of us. And it's kind of like, don't do this thing. But Judas is so focused on the dark, he's turning his back from the light. And I think because it was showing the sin that he had. And sometimes when you see something in yourself and you're not willing to change, you turn your back, right? That's what we all do. We all turn our backs to each other. I mean, not to each other, but like to the light. Like, I don't want to change that. I want to have blinders on. And like Becky was talking about, people stay in the darkness because they don't want to change. And not only do they not want to change, they're actively resisting the change after they have knowledge that they need to change. And then that's where the brokenness comes. That's where the damage comes. So it has a real effect on you. And it's not something that happens after you have physical death. You're going to suffer with that now. So I just thought like what everybody said tonight is amazing. So thank you.
Thank you, Evanique. Wonderful comments. Thank you. Next up is Joe, followed by Gary. Joe.
So I'm going to be very, very brief because I think Becky and Evanique and Myron have actually hit on a lot of the points that I had wanted to. But I do think that just connecting back to something that I had talked about last week was just John's, Jesus' love for John, and how Aquinas had written earlier in the text, how actions are actually more important than words. And throughout the Gospels, John has demonstrated his actions versus actually talking about himself. And I thought that that's profound, because you think about it in terms of also in people and how they demonstrate their we're all inspired by an individual who acts rather than speaks about what they do. It's okay if you speak and act, but just the importance of that, and that Jesus loves John. That was just something profoundly eye-opening to me, because I've never really thought about it from that perspective. Anyway, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Gary. Gary, feel free to take as much time as you want to comment. Go ahead.
No, we've been doing this for a while now. So I'm okay to keep it brief. First off, I really like how much the conversation has gone towards talking about John as the beloved, and especially like so many people have brought it up, that idea. And I see, like, as a group, we're meditating on just acknowledging that grace that's being bestowed and how John notices it, and Judas doesn't. Something that was eye-opening to me is that the Gospel of John, when it talks about belief, it talks about it in two characteristics. There's the belief, the unbelief that's remedied, it's ignorance that's remedied by facts. And so throughout the gospel, you see this idea of a witness, pointing to things, seeing things. It's all evidence is right there, and it's intended to remedy that ignorance. And so having the evidence displayed before you, it's like, certainly you're going to believe. And he has two purpose statements. He says it in chapter 19, these things are there that you might believe. My witness is true. And he repeats it again at the end. But the other angle of unbelief is the willful ignorance. And it's also, like, even in psychology, they call a delusion as a fixed false belief that's unresponsive to evidence or reason. And that's what we see in the enemies of John, or of Jesus, throughout the gospel, is they see the evidence, they're no longer ignorant, but then John says they don't believe. And so he's referring to the willful unbelief that's taking place there. And relating to what everybody else was saying about the grace, that's just really what's so astounding, is Judas as an archetype of the unbeliever is still, you mentioned this, Shrikant, he receives the morsel from Jesus. He just had his feet washed. Is that God loves the whole world, and that includes those who have rejected him, and his grace is overshadowing, is just showering on everybody, regardless of who is there. And that's the beauty of the beloved disciple, is he's the one who noticed. And that's really what the whole gospel is saying, is that it's there, it's everywhere. Notice it. That's it. That's, and so that stuck out to me. That was really, for me, the most profound thing. Two other things that are just kind of like housekeeping is probably influence from Greek philosophy. We think of body, soul, and spirit. And in the Hebrew concept, that's not true at all. It's that when they use the word soul, they're talking about the whole being that includes the physical and the spiritual and everything together. And so it's like noticing that distinction might be helpful, especially when we look at Aquinas, or even challenging our own thoughts when we come to the text. As we sometimes, I find myself wanting to do it to tease out the three parts, as if they were distinguished things, but they weren't recognized as separate things in the Hebrew concept. But the other was something that Ron brought about the past, the present, and the future all taking place in the moment. And Brian put an exclamation point, but it was sent as a direct message to me. And so he should actually be going next after me. But before, this is my last point I wanted to bring up. And he might have already tracked this, is that there's a Jewish belief that the entire nation of Israel, past, present, and future, was present at Mount Sinai and personally received the law. And so when we talk about, I keep bringing up like this mythic understanding of the scriptures, is that the Jewish festivals aren't just memorials, they're somehow present in the original iteration of the event and participating with God in it. And so we see this in the New Testament, Paul, when he talks about us being crucified with Christ on the cross. The same kind of instantiation, there's this mystical presence where we're not just reflecting on something that happened to us, we're there engaged with him and presently participating. And that's a phenomena that I'm still trying to work my head around, because it's a completely different way of thinking. But thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. So we're going to go with Ron, Becky, and Brian, and then I'm going to ask Gary and anybody else who wants to comment about the Gospel of John. We've talked about John the Apostle quite a bit today, but I do want to talk about Gospel of John itself as a work, and how, I love it, and I'm not, and I would love to hear what other people's reaction to it is and what they see in it. And we'll start with Gary at that point, and then anybody else who wants to comment. It's going to be Ron, Becky, and Brian, and then we'll continue on the chart. Go ahead, Ron.
I'll be brief as well. Just touching on what Gary just said. There's this concept of a corporate head, how all of us were present in Adam when Adam sinned. And that's why we all are partaking of that. We were all there. That's very much in Jewish thought, especially towards the Second Temple period. It's really a different thing. The other thing was how we're talking about John being aware of this grace. One of the things I do when I'm studying the Bible is I look up the meaning for every name, and it's not a coincidence. John means grace. That's what his very name means, and he's the one that sees it. The other is in the question that's been brought up a couple of times. Was it Judas? Was it Satan? And if you look at the underlying Greek texts, it's very vague. You cannot actually tell what the referent is. It's both and. So when we see Judas in this place given just such an amazing honor by being given the bread from the very hand of Jesus, if we look at the person of Satan in heaven who rebelled against God, he was the anointed cherub that covered the glory of God. He was the closest to God. And it's the very same. So it's not, was it Judas or was it Satan? It was both. And what Gary said earlier about this being covered in much more detail by Paul in Ephesians, he says, or in Ephesians and in Romans, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. It wasn't just Judas. We wrestle against principalities and powers and rulers of darkness in the heavenlies. So just amazing how this all ties through. It's just amazing. What great conversations. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you. Next up is going to be Becky and Brian. Let's keep it a little bit brief so we can talk a little bit about the gospel. Go ahead, Becky.
I wanted to continue off of what you were saying about dying to self and it being in the mind. And so continuing also off of Myron from reading Romans 12, I appeal to you by the mercies of God to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So the aim is to go after the will of God because it is the perfect ideal. It's good, acceptable, and perfect. And through the transformation of your mind, by dying to your thoughts and letting things go and things being reborn, you're conforming in order to be better. And so that is a sacrifice, and that sacrifice leads to something that's pleasing to God. This is really parallels a lot to one of my favorite quotes by Jordan Peterson. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, therefore it's time to examine your values. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. It's time to let go. It might even be time to sacrifice what you love best so that you can become who you might become instead of staying who you are.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Brian, let's keep it brief. Brian, go ahead.
I agree with you and John that really can't tease out a difference between the person of Jesus and the plan and the path. It all goes together. I thought that the passage that Myron read from Romans really captures that. And that a key element of I don't think when you talk about the person of Jesus, I don't think you can leave out his words or actions. I think that that's a part of it, because in the beginning was the Word became flesh, Word took actions, and suffered things. I don't think you can leave out what he did and suffered. Just a little, let me say before I forget, Gary said that the Old Testament after Joshua was written primarily after it was a post-exilic document. I don't think, you want to double check that. I don't think that's true. I think most people think it was first written during the reign of Josiah by the Deuteronomists under the leadership of the high priest Hilkiah, who was the father or grandfather of Jeremiah. And there were revisions to this after the exile, but people are pretty confident they can identify what came before and after. But so I think you just ought to qualify that statement a little bit, if I understood it correctly. So I guess one thing I'm keeping my eye on is just the person of Christ. What is his path? What is he modeling? At this point, I feel that, I don't know, I'm going to continue to watch it because it's always new for me. But at this point, I'm, submission, as Evanique said, I think is a key word, but he obviously clearly was, as it said, he's also the teacher, the rabbi, all the rest. And he did take on the temple establishment on that last week twice. But he didn't take any actions against the Roman government. And I think his words and actions are pretty consistently accepting the Roman rule of Judea. And that's just something I'm keeping my eye on right now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. That's the beauty of us human beings. It includes everything. It includes your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, and it's one complex whole. There is an integrity to it. It is a prototype. It is something that captures everything. All right.
Can I say one more thing briefly?
Very briefly, please.
Talk a lot about Judas. There are books on Judas. I've talked to ministers about Judas. There's historical assertions or backgrounds about Judas that he was a zealot, and his betrayal was intended, that's called a betrayal. His intent in doing it was to provoke Jesus to take more of a political role, which he declined to do.
Thank you. All right. So the next question is, we're going to end this with it, but I would love, people's comment on it. What does Gospel of John, this particular gospel, mean to you, and what do you think it is? What are your thoughts? We'll start with Gary, then Joe, and then anybody else who wants to share. Go ahead and type ! Gary, please take your time.
Probably the thing that sticks out for me the most in the Gospel of John is relating to the part that Ron was talking about, the instantiation of ourselves, and that community with God, is something that I ran into with like the mythical studies of Mircea Eliade, where he talks about hierophanies and just the axis mundi, the location of God in a sacred space. And so what happens through John, like beginning in the first chapter, Jesus references the story in Genesis where Jacob is asleep and has this dream of the angels of God ascending and descending and going into heaven. And Jesus says, I am that ladder. I am that axis mundi where heaven and earth come together. And so that's in the first chapter there. It's like we already have this this really profound mythical thing that goes on. And then throughout Jewish tradition, that becomes, instantiated in the tabernacle is where the Shekinah glory dwells. Then they build a temple, and that's where it is. And then throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus attributes to himself the attributes of the temple and the attributes of the tabernacle. And he says, I am that thing. I am that thing that where the glory of God dwells. And so when we finally get to that, that statement, I am the way, the truth, and the light. It's funny because modern evangelicalism says, well, that means you say this 3-line Jesus prayer, and then you go to heaven. And I don't know that it's way more profound than that. When he talks about I am the way, he is that locus of glory. He is the point that we go to for worship. There's just so much imbued in it. And so for me, back to the idea of John's temple Christology and everything that's going on and what Jesus embodies, that sticks out to me just so profound. Later, when we get to the farewell discourse, in John 15, he repeats the command to love. And he says that he's the vine and we're branches. And so he's the axis mundi, but we're grafted into it. And so we are a part of God in that sense. And then what do? Is we bear fruit as a passive thing. And that fruit is there to be shared. And so we become the axis mundi by which the rest of the world has access to God, and partakes of the fruit that is borne by God, attachment to it. And so that's the part that sticks out so much for me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. That was beautiful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Evanique. Joe.
I'll be very, very brief because what I thought that what Gary shared was excellent. But there's something overarching that I've always felt about the Gospel of John is that it's focused more on the metaphysical, and that idea being able to that it incorporates them, on a more metaphysical level than the other Gospels, is that it allows you to understand the essence of what Christ is saying. And it allows you to also make connections to other things. And in that way, I find it to be more transformative than, other Gospels that focus a little bit more on the literal kind of textual, kind of documentational approach. And it also transcends, it allows you to make connections to other religious texts, which is important for me personally, but in general. So I think it gets to the heart, the essence of what Christ was saying, and allows us to commune with the text in a more substantive way.
Wonderful.
So
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Evanique, followed by Becky. If anybody else wants to comment on the Gospel of John itself, go ahead and type ! Evanique.
I look at the Gospel of John as a guidebook on how to love. How to love your enemies, how to love your friends, how to love yourself. I think with how to love, I think it starts with how to love yourself, how to love God first. And I think Jesus demonstrates this several times where he submits to God's will. He's telling you, I'm coming to do the work of the one who sent me. And, in that sense, his life is not his own. He has given his life to God, and he is God. And so by giving his life to God, he gives his life to himself. And that leads to the point about, teaching us to love ourselves, because if we love God and God is in us, we have to love ourselves. There is no other way to do that, because which leads me to the third point of how are we going to love other people? We have to love God and love ourselves and then love others, because if we accept God's grace, we can give it to other people. We can be more graceful. And I think even how to love your enemies, hating them only hurts you. Like I think of Jesus and Judas, but even like the Pharisees, if Jesus hated them, like he would have destroyed him and it destroyed God's plan for us and for our salvation. What he did was he was straight with them. Like he didn't beat around the bush. I think sometimes we have this theory of love that it's all flowers and sunshine, and it's not. It's telling people hard truths sometimes. And sometimes they're just not going to like it. But if you're doing it, I think it's the intention in which you're doing it. If you're doing it truly because you love them and you want to bring them to glory, or like Jesus was trying to save them, you do it. Even if it's hard, even if it's going to make them turn against you, you do it. But you got to do it out of love, and that's how you love your enemies. And even on the cross, he said, "Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do." Like, and they were calling for his crucifixion. They were laughing at him. They were not kind to him at all. They were saying he deserved what he got. They were taunting him. He shows how to love your enemies, and he carries that love and grace to the bitter end. So I just think he shows us how to love all around, and he also teaches the lesson, which is the Gospel of John, of it's not always easy to do, and a lot of times it's just not going to be easy to do. So that's what it symbolizes for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is Becky.
Well, for me, the Gospel of John is more than just an intellectual exercise. What I'm really drawn to with this is the prologue, and just like mostly the first few lines. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was in him. In him was life, and life was the light of men. And for me, it's if this is true, and he is the Word, and everything was created in him, heaven, earth, everything, and that's reality. And if you're really genuine about looking out for what is true, then I would say that this is where I need to go. I've tried the path of atheism, and it did not lead me to a very bright place. Led me down nihilism, and it comes down to, well, are you willing to let your mind be transformed, and let those presuppositions go? And I think for me, over the past 3 years, I've been slowly doing that and testing what is true and adopting those. And a lot of what has remained true, tested over, I guess you could say, through trials and fire. I would say this is what holds. So that's what the Gospel of John means to me.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Ron.
I don't know if anyone's seen this before. It's certainly not my idea, but each of the Gospels presents Jesus from a different mindset. Matthew is looking at Jesus as the fulfillment of Scripture. Matthew is the longest and is constantly saying, as it was written. Mark shows him as the suffering servant that was predicted, especially in Isaiah 53. Luke is looking at him as the ultimate human being, the descendant from Adam. And then John, Shrikant, as you very first began talking about the Gospel of John as an eagle, he's showing him as the Theanthropos, the God-man, God who became flesh. So when I'm reading John, I see this in every page. Every miracle that he does shows that he's sovereign over death, over disease, over blindness, over nature itself, as the one who created it, and not only created but sustains all these things. And then tying this last thing that Becky said with what Gary said as well early on. My thought lost me now. It's gone. It's gone. Yeah. Anyway, yes, that's what John is for me, at least. It presents Jesus as not just a good not just as a good philosopher. If this is true, Gary touched on it not being an intellectual exercise, and so did Becky. And there's two words that are used throughout the Gospels and in John for knowing. I know can be either gnosko, I know these facts, and then Jesus raises it to another one, and John raises to another, pisteo in Greek. And not only do I know these as facts, but I'm relying on them as the fact. It's one thing for me to know that this chair will hold me up. It's another thing for me to sit in it and pick my feet up and trust it. Two different aspects. So.
Wow. Thank you, Ron. So folks, I don't know how I can thank all of you folks, because this is just so I just love Gospel of John. It causes me no end of trouble because I can't read anything else, because I have to, it keeps bringing me back. I've tried to read. I do read other things. I love Romans. I love everything by Paul, Ephesians, Romans, a lot of things. But it's like periodically, or very quickly, I have to come back to John, and I want to kind of keep going through it, because I think that it actually, it's like the culmination. It's like the apex. It just, everything kind of flows there, and I am completely mesmerized by its beauty. When I asked Nick, so what do you like about John? Because he truly loves Gospel of John. And he says, I don't know. It's like he says, I don't know, because it's just, I don't know, God made me this way, that I respond to this particular work. And I can see in it, it just speaks, to me in some way. So I and I want to also tell you that I am learning so much from each and every one of you here, because this is really special. This is really special. In some ways, everything that we have done in 52 Living Ideas is supporting this level of conversation. Partly it is what we are looking at. Gospel of John, which is inspiring, which is actually, it elevates everything. It elevates the dialogue. And partly, as Becky was saying, it actually touches you in a very deep way. And it does that differently for each of us. And everybody here has been so generous in sharing that with each other and learning, seeing things. It's like the eagle, eagle, if you use Ron's take of future and past, it's like eagles are everywhere. And they're at a very low level, very high level, from this angle, that angle, and they're looking at the whole earth. This is like multiple consciousnesses doing that, and doing that together, with generosity in their hearts for each other. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate that. And thank you, Gary. I think this is very special. So I just want to say one last thing here. Tomorrow, we are going to look at a foot washing scene in Mahabharata, where God washes man's feet, which is actually very, very deep. I don't know whether I'll be able to speak through it without breaking into tears. So I have backup of Rupali to help me if I fail to continue. So it is a very profound work for people who have shared the Gita journey with us. This is a way of, on once a month, we are going back to Gita. We're going to look at some new themes and we're going to connect it up. So it's an opportunity of talking about what you got from Gita. And it is a way of making new connections. And tomorrow it is going to be connecting these two scenes together. So don't miss it. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye, everybody. See you.